First Minute Capital is a $100 million seed stage fund, sector agnostic, and proudly backed by a number of top technology founders, including 30 unicorn founders. The My First Minute series is about learning from prior generations of successful entrepreneurs and sharing their insights and lessons with the next generation of tech founders. The series has two focuses. One, how they got started in their careers, their first minute, if you will. And two, how they see the world today and what they're most excited about. My name is Spencer Crawley. I'm co-founder and general partner at First Minute Capital. And today I'm speaking to Hermann Hauser. We have the brilliant and wonderful Hermann with us. The background you can see of Hermann's is actually a part of his New Zealand home, so he's definitely winning the lockdown battle. But Hermann is a physicist and really a science-based innovator. He's co-founded over 20 companies. He's been a venture capitalist for over 20 years. An honorary KBE followed an honorary knighthood in 2015 or 2016, Hermann, your knighthood?
Yes, one of those.
One of those, exactly. And he's a fellow of the Royal Society, of the Royal Academy of Engineering. I think actually we have some members of the Royal Academy of Engineering on the line. The Royal Society of Chemistry, the Institute of Physics. He's donated a lot of money to both healthcare and education, to charitable causes. And Amadeus Capital is the fund that you all know, but of course the founding story that we're going to touch on today is that of Acorn, from which Arm spun out. And Arm, I think, needs no real detail other than to say it was probably one of the largest exits in European tech history in a $31 billion acquisition by Softbank, and most mobile phones today use ARM processors. Did I miss out anything absolutely critical, Hermann? I know there's the precursor to tablet computers and E-Trade and many more, but did I cover the broad brushstrokes?
I'm sure that will do, yes.
Okay. Well, Hermann, I thought perhaps where we would start, given that we were just talking about it before everyone joined us, is about lockdown. And how have you been finding it?
Well, yeah, for us, really nothing changed other than my neighboring property is one of the nicest regional parks in New Zealand. And it was also locked down except for the neighbors. So I got this 3-kilometer beach where I normally run in the morning all to myself, which was the only change that I experienced, because we're on the farm anyway most of the time, and New Zealand has handled the coronavirus debacle absolutely brilliantly. And we've got a prime minister who went in hard and went in early. So we have 21 deaths and 100 live cases at the moment. And it's just brilliant. So our flight back to Europe was cancelled, so we're actually stuck here. That's why I'm here, not back in the UK. But out of all places in the world to be stuck at the moment, a farm in New Zealand is not a bad one.
And Jacinda Ardern, she primarily took a very tough approach at the beginning of the forced lockdown. What were some of the key steps that she did that perhaps we haven't done here in the UK or the US?
Very tough and very immediate, and you've got to stay home. Nobody was allowed to leave home except to go to the supermarkets, which of course remained open. In the supermarkets, you had to, there was a queue outside, and the queue had to have a 2-meter distance between the people queuing. And then when you were inside, you had to have a 2-meter distance between all the people that were buying there. This was just one example. And the great thing about the New Zealanders, because they're totally behind their prime minister, everybody just admires her, not just from outside New Zealand, but also inside New Zealand. Everybody thinks she's doing a fantastic job. So all the New Zealanders really follow her instructions to the letter. So they've been incredibly disciplined, and that's what and of course the other thing that the UK didn't do is to be absolutely religious about testing and tracking and then following up the tracking. So I remember I was in Taupo the day before the lockdown. There was one case in Taupo. I went to a breakfast place, and that breakfast place, before the lockdown, everybody had to give their address, just in case there was another case, somebody who was at that breakfast place developed COVID, so that they could contact everybody and follow them up. And that was really the reason behind the phenomenal success in New Zealand.
And did you, because in the UK, as you know, we were fed a heavy diet that at the beginning, at least in early mid-March, that herd immunity might be the way forward. Did you ever buy that?
That was idiotic. You didn't need a PhD in epidemiology to realize that if you went for herd immunity and you need 50 to 60% of the population to be infected, and you let everybody be infected, it completely overwhelms the health system and kills off people the way we've seen it in the hospitals in Pergamum. It was completely loony.
Well, we as of Sunday, as you also know, Hermann, we've had the brilliant message of stay alert. I know that you were on the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology for over a decade, and you mentioned that pandemics did come up on that council. If you were advising the UK government now, everything is what it is, what would you be advising Mr. Johnson?
Just copy what South Korea, Taiwan, China, and if you don't believe in copying anybody in Asia, which Western arrogance, of course, makes it very hard to copy anything that these guys know how to do, just copy New Zealand rather than trying to reinvent the wheel.
Well, I think if we shift from the short-term gloomy present, let's hope this will lift soon, right back to your entrepreneurial first minute, Hermann. Perhaps we might skip.
Just make one last point, because I think it's an important one. And one of the reasons why Asian countries have done so much better is because most of the government officials in Asia are engineers. And, we are run by an innumerate classicist. And in the US, we're just run by somebody who is innumerate and illiterate. They're even worse. So no scientific, no engineering background, whereas Asia does.
Have you come across Chris Whitty and some of the SAGE committee? Do you know some of those figures well?
I don't know them well. I have come across Chris Whitty, and as you know, the person that I do know very well is David King, who is now heading up an independent inquiry, which I think is very necessary, because if nothing else, we should learn how to deal with a situation like this, which without any shadow of a doubt is going to happen again.
Well, that's a sobering thought, but hopefully our country and other countries are better protected for this for that next scenario. But Hermann, perhaps the year that I might go back to as your first minute entrepreneurial speaking was we might fast forward your father's wine business, and you're studying in Vienna, and I think you did a year of military service. You then went to Cambridge to do a PhD in physics. But perhaps if we start in 1979 with yourself and Chris Curry, what you both went to ask for a £10,000. I don't know if it was a loan or an equity ticket, but this was the beginning of something called Cambridge Processor Unit, which then became ARM, which then of course, which then became Acorn, which then of course spun out ARM. What were you and Chris? Well, how did you and Chris meet, and what were you thinking about in that year?
Well, it was actually 78, and we met socially, in Shades. Shades was the famous bar in Cambridge, and he had been working with Clive Sinclair, was sort of Clive's right-hand man, and he got fed up with Clive and really wanted to run his own business. And he said, shall we start a microprocessor consultancy? And interestingly, the idea It is amazing, considering that ARM, has become probably the most successful microprocessor in the world. At that time, there was so much excitement about the chip. It wasn't even called a microprocessor, it was called a chip. And the BBC aired a memorable program called When the Chips Are Down. And they said there might be a chip in every home sometime in the future. By the chip, they meant the microprocessor. And there was a group at the university called the Microprocessor Group. So there was tremendous excitement about microprocessors that were so small that ordinary students could actually start building home processor kits, which was actually our first business at Acorn. And at CPU, CPU stood for Cambridge Processing Unit. So when Chris and I met and thought what company we might want to start, we had a very detailed business plan, which was, it's all happening in microprocessors. We want to be part of it. And that was it. I often think back to those days that if I came to myself now for money, would I have given myself money? And the answer is absolutely not. But then we didn't actually need any money, because one of the so Chris said, look, we ought to start a company. And I said, okay, well, how much does it cost? He says 50 quid. Do you have 50 quid? I said, yeah, I've got 50 quid. Let's start. If it cost £1,000, because in those days, I think still it's very cheap to start companies in the UK, as opposed to Austria at the time. It should have been 1,000. If it had been £1,000, we wouldn't have started Acorn or CPU. Right. And but £100, didn't last very long, and it wasn't the sort of start capital that was enough. So we went to Mr. Knight. He was called, the manager of National Westminster Bank, and asked him for £10,000 for a loan. There was no venture capital in those days. This was 1978. And there was no business angel. So the only way could finance anything in those days was through a bank loan. So, but we had no security, no nothing. So the manager said, it's jolly good to see young people start companies. And then he did his due diligence. And his due diligence was, now, which college did you go to? And the window in his office looked out onto King's College. So I could point out of his office and said, that one over there. And he said, oh, that's all right. Here's £10,000. And good luck. And then we came back about 3 months later and said, things are going really well now. Oh, he says, yes, I can see that, you're in the black, because it basically was it wasn't even a loan, it was an overdraft. And he could see that once a month we're in the black, because we were a consultancy company, microprocessor consultancy company. And says, it's going really well, but we now need a bit more money. And he says, well, how much do you need? I said, 50,000. He says, jolly good to see young people do, great things. Here is £50,000. So this went on, and then 2 years later, we came back. It's going really well now. And I said, yeah, but we need some more money. And he said, well, how much do you need? And he said, well, $1 million. This was way above his pay grade. He had no idea what we were doing. He had no inkling what a computer was or what microprocessors were. And a guy called Matthew Bullock of Barclays was the only British banker who at the time had gone to Silicon Valley and studied Apple. And he came back and he gave us basically the £1 million as an overdraft. This was still an overdraft. Now you would ask, why on earth would he do this? And the answer was, we already had £1.3 million in an escrow account of people who prepaid for their BBC Micro. So the only thing that he needed to check is whether we could actually build the computer, collect the escrow account, and then his £1 million would be safe. And that's exactly what happened. We changed from National Westminster to Barclays, and the next 50 companies that I started in Cambridge all went with Barclays.
That was good business for Barclays. We're going to come back to the BBC Micro, but to the point you mentioned, Hermann, of Hermann the VC might not have funded Hermann the founder of Acorn in '78. When there are lots and lots of venture capitalists as well as founders on the line, when you, and of course now it's very much it's critical for a founder to have a vision of how they're going to change the world and how this product is solving a huge problem. And the long-term ambition and vision is seen as a prerequisite for any founder looking for funding. It sounds like Chris and yourself it was a more organic process where you had an idea and you wanted to start something. You were very practical about it. Did you think at that stage of what you wanted Acorn to become in 20 years, or what was your frame of mind at that point?
Well, the thing that we realized, which I think we got right, is that the appearance of the microprocessor, which allowed the construction of really inexpensive computers, was revolutionary, because until then, I did my PhD on an IBM 370 in our computer lab in Cambridge, and only the anointed were allowed to go into the computer room, which was an air-conditioned room, and touch, and program the computer itself. Of course, you could run jobs on the outside, etc., but you had no direct connection with the computer. And there, these $10 microprocessors or whatever they cost appeared, and all of a sudden you could build your own computer and program it yourself. And that was the excitement about Acorn. And we wanted to, so the vision, to start off with, we were a consultancy company with CPU, but very quickly, the vision was to provide a very inexpensive computer for the home enthusiasts to build computers themselves. And that was actually our first great success with our level 1 system, and then with the Acorn Atom, which looks a bit like a BBC Micro, but is a predecessor of the BBC Micro, and was a very successful computer, just an Acorn computer.
And for those not familiar, worth perhaps just adding that the BBC Micro was the series of microcomputers built by Hermann's company Acorn in the early '80s. And I think, Hermann, there was an accompanying show on BBC Two called The Computer Program that people watched all over the country every day.
It was just amazing. It's sort of difficult to take you back into 1980, pre-smartphones, pre-computers, digitization. And then the BBC puts on a program called The Computer Program. And you wouldn't believe this, but people went home from the pub at 6 o'clock to watch the computer program. It was one of the most popular programs on the BBC. It was a bit like, I don't know, one of those most popular programs. And to start off with, there was a series of 10 computer programs, which were then extended to another 30. So this lasted for a few years, and people just wanted to find out what these computers are all about. And the BBC, in their wisdom, decided that the only way to teach the people to educate a nation about computers was to let them buy one and have a hands-on experience and let them program it themselves. And that really was the success of the BBC microcomputer.
Well, I know that also led to a generation of software developers who became enthusiastic thanks to everything that you did, Hermann. Maybe one last moment in that journey, which seemed to be a very important one, which was when you approached Intel in the early '80s, asking for a new processor. And I think they turned you away, which led to a rather important moment. What happened there?
Yes, that was a funny story. The BBC Micro was based on the 6502, like the Apple II, only ours ran twice as fast. Actually, it's interesting to compare the BBC Micro with the Apple II because our processor ran twice as fast. We had color. Apple was black and white. We mixed graphics and text on the screens. They didn't know how to do that. And every BBC Micro always had a networking connection, which Apple didn't at the time. So we were way ahead of Apple there. But the 6502 is an 8-bit processor and was running out of steam. So we needed either a 16-bit or a 32-bit processor. And we looked at all the processors in the world at the time, from Motorola, from National Semiconductor, and from Intel. So we went to Intel and said, your 8286, which was their processor at the time, is actually not a bad processor. You just screwed up the pinout, because they put both the address and the data bus on the same pins. So you couldn't produce the architect, you couldn't use that microprocessor to produce the architecture that we had in the BBC Micro, which is twice as fast as the Intel architecture, also that you could use the same processor. So we said, you screwed up the pinout, but if you just sell us the die rather than the chip, we'll do our own pinout and maybe we can make something of this chip. And they, of course, said, get lost. We were a little Cambridge company. But we were also very arrogant and very successful at the time. So we said, well, you get lost, we'll do our own. The only reason why the ARM exists.
And Hermann, to those founders who are listening, who many of them are taking on very large incumbents, and arguably, or probably today, the incumbents are even stronger than they have been before historically. What gave you the confidence and the certainty that you could build something that could take on Intel?
Sophie and Steve. One of the things that's always been extraordinary at Acorn, and Roger Needham, who ran the computer laboratory at the time, called Acorn a Hoover for talent. So we had just all the smartest people in Cambridge working for us. And Steve and Sophie said, we can do this. And I believed them. And the other reason why we could was a very fortunate coincidence that just at that time, that year, John Hennessy and Patterson at Stanford and Berkeley, respectively, invented RISC, for reduced instruction set computers. And the basic idea of a reduced instruction set computers is to reduce the number of instructions you have in a microprocessor, make it very much smaller. Because it is very much smaller, you can make it run a lot faster. And as it turns out, since you retain the instruction set that is used 95% of the time anyway, you get a fantastic overall performance win. But because it made the microprocessor design so much smaller and so much simpler, Acorn, which was, a comparatively small company, although, we were the first company in Britain to go from 0 to 100 million pound revenue in just 5 years. It was, we went completely tiny. And of course, we were so successful that we thought, we could do anything. And in the particular case of doing the microprocessor, we could.
And on the hoovering up talent, because again, that's a question that's absolutely front of mind for every founder of any stage. But so Sophie Wilson and Steve Ferber, was it obvious to you at the time that because you had Acorn and this was a business that spun out of Acorn and ARM, I think the JV with Apple happened in 1990. But was it an obvious pairing to you at the time?
Well,
in terms of complementarity of people and.
Sophie and Steve had already done the BBC microcomputer, so I knew they were extremely good. And everybody around the world that wrote reviews of the BBC Micro was very complimentary about the architecture and the way it was put together, and the BBC Basic, which Sophie wrote, and the clever design of making it go twice as fast as the Apple. So that gave me some confidence. But the other was just the back of the envelope performance figures that we hoped to achieve, which turned out to be correct. Because the amazing numbers, and it's sort of unbelievably, it's unbelievable that happened at the time. The most popular 8-bit processor at the time was a processor called the Z80. And the Z80 had roughly 30,000 transistors. And the ARM has 30,000 transistors, but it has 20 times the performance of a Z80. It was just amazing that this architectural breakthrough of RISC and two geniuses, Sophie and Stephen, implemented that RISC idea. By the way, this is one of the very few occasions where something was invented in the US, in Stanford and in Berkeley, but the first commercial implementation was done in Cambridge with the ARM. So Hennessy finally founded a company called MIPS, but the MIPS processor, which is also a RISC processor, actually came out later than the ARM, which was based on his ideas.
Fascinating. Well, I know commercialization of all sorts of innovation, whether science-based or otherwise, is something you think a lot about today. Maybe to skip several decades of huge success and market domination of ARM, just to touch on where ARM is today. I know at the time of the Softbank acquisition, from the point of view of the United Kingdom, you felt this was a loss based on the fact that ARM was one of the, as you put it, one of the few IT companies with a genuinely global footprint that had come out of the UK. How do you feel about it now, and how is ARM doing?
Well, at that time, I made the point that it is very sad that a UK company, or for a passionate European like me, a European company, will become headquartered in Japan. What I also said is that I believed Son-san when he said that he will make further investments in ARM, he will grow ARM, he will relieve ARM of the quarterly reporting constraints, and make ARM grow. And he has done that. He has been true to his word, and he has funded, has continued to let ARM, well, he didn't need to fund it because ARM had $1 billion when it in cash when he bought it. But there were two reasons why I thought this was dangerous. One, it's headquartered in Japan, and if things don't go well, the first thing that they will not do is look after a European company. But the second thing is that although I believed Son-san's good intentions, he had already retired once. And what if he, finds another belle du jour that he likes better than ARM? Will ARM get the support going forward? Because there wasn't really any reason for ARM to be bought then, other than a financial one, because ARM had $1 billion of cash in the bank, and a management team to die for, a market share of, as we quoted at ARM, over 95% in smartphones. If you actually look at the numbers, it's 100%, because if you round it up to the nearest percent, because Intel never managed to get above 0.5% with their Atom before they gave up. It's a bit of a sad story for Europe, really, that it had to go that way. But so far it's worked well. Let's see, but 5 years is a short time. Let's see what the next 5 years bring.
Yes, and let's hope Cambridge and other UK cities can breed the next ARM. But Hermann, maybe to use that as a segue to you as an investor. Well, actually, maybe linking, you mentioned John Hennessy earlier. You've been in the orbit and known some of the fellow titans of tech, whether it's Bezos or Gates or Jobs. Do you feel that you ever identify consistent qualities amongst some of those really major players?
Well, consistent qualities, now that's an interesting one. Well, they're all very high energy individuals, but they're very, very different. I mean, Steve Jobs was unbelievably arrogant. In those days, we all met at the PC forum, at Esther Dyson's PC forum. This was the beginning of the PC industry, right? So Steve and Bill and everybody just sat on the same table, and we discussed the world and how the feature wars of Lotus Notes versus Excel, etc. It was all great fun. And they're all very different. I mean, Steve was by far the most arrogant of them. I always felt he had the least reason to be arrogant, because he wasn't particularly smart, and that's maybe why he was arrogant. However, he had this ability to motivate his team, both with stick and carrot, like nobody else I've seen. People would die for Steve Jobs, and they would die for acknowledgement that they've done something well. If Steve said, "This guy, look at what Andy Hertzfeld has just done," he put them in a pedestal, and then the next moment he said, "Oh, what a lot of crap," and he takes them right down. So there's an emotional roller coaster in that, but it generated unbelievable energies in his team. And I remember when he, I do a lot with Tony Fadell now, who did the iPod and the iPhone, and he actually showed me the iPhone. I've been one of the very few people in the world who saw the iPhone before it was launched. In a parking lot in Santa Clara, I remember. I had dinner with Tony, and I said, "Can you show it to me? Show it to me." Everybody was very excited about it. This is like, "I can't show it to you in a restaurant. I'm surrounded by everybody. Let's go out into the parking lot." And it was dark, look at the iPhone, and it was, it was very impressive. And then Steve launches it.
Yes.
He says, "I've reinvented the phone." And I thought, what arrogance. I mean, the guy, you got to give it to say, reinvented the phone. And I was very close to the Nokia people at the time, to the chairman and the CTO at Nokia. And they all sighed a big sigh of relief after the iPhone was launched by Steve Jobs. And they said, we thought it was a good phone. It's a crap phone. Because every single thing that they valued in a phone, the iPhone was crap about. It was crap battery life, poor bandwidth, the different bands that the phone needed to cover around world. Nokia was much better. A bad reception on the radio chip. So everything that Nokia used to assess their phones, the iPhone was crap at. The fact that the user interface and the API and the fact that you could build a whole application layer on top was the revolution. They didn't understand.
Fascinating. That yes, I can that 07 moment I think was reading more about it and your own reaction to it. I actually found a 2010 interview of you, Hermann, for UKTI, UK Traders Initiative, and you actually at that point predicted that there was going to be a convergence of the delivery of media, and at that point already you were convinced that mobile would win over PC and television, which wasn't obvious at all, I think, at that stage, but certainly trend-wise you were spot on. If we move to...
It does happen, rarely, but sometimes it is.
Well, I hope Amadeus made some investments at the time. If we move to trends that you're looking at now, there are, you're a real polymath, Hermann, and I know that your interests span from computational genomics to blockchain to AI and ML to, I was interested, that fintech has been a big interest of yours. It almost feels too prosaic for someone of your sort of scientific caliber. But what areas are you spending most time on now that when you look to the next 10 years?
Well, I believe there are 4 areas that are going to change our lives in the next 5 to 10 years, not 10 to 30. And the 4 are, of course, AI and machine learning, and everybody, I think, is convinced of that now. It wasn't when I first said it. The second thing, in my opinion, is actually the blockchain and smart contracts. Mm-hmm. And it's the combination of blockchain and smart contracts. and I'm a great believer in that because it allows us to automate business processes. So all the things that we do through paper or even with early digitization can be automated if you implement it as smart contracts. The two missing pieces, in my opinion, before this can go mainstream is automated KYC, know your customer, and automated AML, anti-money laundering. Because at the moment, the blockchain reeks of course, fraud, and 80% of the ICOs were fraudulent. So it has a bit of a terrible reputation. But that shouldn't distract from the soundness of the maths behind the blockchain itself, and the soundness of combining it with smart contracts to automate lots of things that need a lot of manual interventions at the moment. So that's my second point, my second theme. The third one is synthetic biology, because I think we're about to see the dawn of the era where we can synthesize genes, not just sequence them. And one of my companies, Evonetics, which actually has some of the same people that did Solexa, which some of you may know. Solexa became the most successful gene sequencing company in the world. I think we are doing 90% of all the gene sequencing in the world is now done on Solexa machines. It was sold to Illumina, so it's the Illumina machine now.
And that was an Amadeus-backed company as well, no?
Amadeus backed Solexa, and we then sold it to Illumina. But that's just gene sequencing. I think if you can synthesize the complete genes, as we will about to witness, then you've got control of the basic building blocks of life. And I think that's actually a much bigger market and much more important, because you can then synthesize all the genomic defects, for example, that are responsible for certain diseases, and study them with much greater ease, because you've got complete control of the protein building blocks that are, of course, translations of the synthesized genes. So that's the third one. And the fourth one, not surprisingly, for a physicist, is quantum computing. And there's some very exciting developments there.
And on that last point, Hermann, quantum, I know that you actually, you sat on, was it Oxford's quantum advisory board that you were for over a decade?
I'm still chairing the single molecule quantum a group advisory board for Andrew Briggs, who did his PhD with me.
Got you. And we'll come back to that, no doubt. Maybe just to take the first of those four macro technological trends in AI and ML, what's your base case for when we reach superintelligence or general artificial intelligence? Is it, which side of 2050 is it?
Probably this side of 2050, but I'm just quoting what the majority of AI people say, who are much more knowledgeable than I am about AI. But what is exciting for a physicist like me is, for me, the fundamental difference between computing before AI and ML and now with machine learning and AI is the change from a first order predicate calculus view of the world, that it either rains or it doesn't rain, or things are red or they're not red. So you have these yes or no and 0 and 1 view of the world, but the new approach is to have a probabilistic view of the world. And it turns out that a probabilistic view of the world gives you this phenomenal power if you combine it with the right data sets and the right machine learning algorithms that we see at the moment. And that is, the latest one, which was really unexpected, is with ImageNet. We had this great breakthrough in machine learning of label data, of supervised learning. Nobody really expected that with BERT, we could expand the size of the parameter space that we have. The latest BERT models, I think, are 10 billion parameters in an unsupervised way. So, there are step functions in AI as well, from supervised to unsupervised to reinforcement and maybe inverse reinforced algorithms, and BERT has just been a spectacular breakthrough in machine translation and question answer systems and in voice recognition. I mean, if you now talk to either Siri or Google, the voice recognition normally works first time and works correctly.
One last one from me. With this, as you've explained, with this change from rules-based thinking to probabilistic algorithms, which are much more powerful, the speed of AI's sort of ubiquity really across all industries and across many aspects of our lives, the most common concern is loss of jobs. Do you see there being significant areas of job creation as a result of AI, or do you see it long term? Do you see actually humans working less because of its impact?
I think both. So, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm no cleverer than the other people. I can just reproduce a few of the arguments that I believe in. So one is we've had lots of these technical revolutions over the last few hundred years, and so far it's always been the case that we've created more new jobs than we've created destroyed old jobs. And you know, whether it's going to happen again this time or not, we will see. But at least there is some precedence of where this has happened in the past. The other thing that is very interesting is if you actually look at the working hours now compared with the working hours just a generation ago, it is much shorter. And there is no reason why we can't reduce this further. I mean, people would probably enjoy a 3-day weekend rather than a two-day weekend. So one of the positive aspects about AI and machine learning is the phenomenal productivity increase that we can have on the back of that. So it then doesn't become an issue even if we destroy jobs. The people that don't have a job, you know, we will have enough money to go around. It is then more an issue of distributing it fairly to everybody rather than you know, people having to go hungry.
I think we have our headline. Hermann Hauser recommends 3-day weekends for all.
And now turning over to Q&A.
Hermann, first of all, thank you for your perspective. As always, it's very, very interesting. Second, on your way back home, why don't you make stopover over here? And the third one is kind of a very wide. You are now in high tech and science for how many years, if I may ask?
Probably 40.
40. So it's high tech,
40.
Science, technology, and entrepreneurs. Can you try and give us in 3 short bullets your main takeaways, your main recommendation, your main do and don't do in the most general way?
Well,
what did
maybe
you learn from life?
Well, maybe the easiest way of answering that is to look at the criteria that I use, my investment criteria. So the first thing is, you know, in order to do anything substantial in life, it's got to have a big market. It's got to be attractive to lots of people. So the size and the growth rate of the market is, you know, one of my starting points when I look at investments. The second point is really the importance of the team and the importance of clever people. Especially in software, as we know, the productivity in software can vary by a factor of 100. I mean, there are these really brilliant software coders that can actually be 100 times better than the mediocre ones. So, but it's also the leadership of the team and the fact, you know, one of the hardest things I find, but also the most rewarding, is to help form a team and bring in new team members to work together with either a brilliant entrepreneur or a brilliant technical person who can lead this. And last but not least, the third one, you know, for a propeller head like me is actually the technology. I love these technologies, and I do think if you have a defensible technology, you can really create big markets and grow substantial companies worldwide, global companies.
Hi, Harman. This is Manoj. What do you think of new AI inferencing chips that are coming in the market? Typically to take over the load of AI compute, and how do you foresee the impact of that in edge computing or AI as a whole?
Oh, good question, and I think a very relevant one. If we just start with the data center one, the big iron one, because as you know, we've got this investment in GraphCore. It is very, very unusual in the history of computing that you need a new type of processor. I was happy to be involved in that revolution of RISC, where you have a revolution of a much smaller processor, which needs a lot less power, and therefore, it became the standard processor in mobile phones because battery life was important. The second time, it was GPUs, because you needed specific processors for video and graphics, and that was the rise of NVIDIA. And in a way, unexpectedly, we have a repeat performance of that, where the requirements of AI and machine learning, which are all graph-based, require a new computer architecture that deals with graphs very well. So the RISC was for scalars, GPUs was for vectors, and GraphCore, as it's called, and the IPU, the Intelligent Processing Unit, is really for graphs, so for dealing with graphs efficiently. And that's why I do believe that there is room for a new Intel, if you like, of the graph world. Your point about AI on the edge is a very important one, though, because even if you have all those big iron, there's phenomenal processing power in the center. There isn't enough bandwidth in the world to deal with the problems closer to the edge. So having these edge processors, and there are a number of really exciting developments happening there, as you probably know them better than I do, things like binarized neural networks, where with very much smaller, it's a bit like RISC, where you say, well, it is well known in the machine learning world that you don't need 32-bit floating point accuracy to represent a graph nodes. So people have backed off to 16-bit and now 8-bit. Lots of people are now using 8-bit entities. There are some people who've gone to 4-bit, and the natural conclusion is, well, try it with 1-bit. Is 1-bit enough? And the surprising result is that there is actually a way, and these are called binarized neural networks, there is actually a way of representing everything that you want to represent just with single-bit entities, with very little loss of accuracy. So that's one of the excitements about the edge.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, it might be a tenuous leap to go from binarized neural networks to ML for document extraction, but we have Martin Goodson next, who's a brilliant founder and one backed by First Minute, and Martin's chair of the data science section of the Royal Statistical Society, and he also is organizing, the organizer of the London Machine Learning Meetup, which is the largest community of ML practitioners in Europe. Martin, over to you to ask your question for Hermann.
Thank you, Spencer, and hi, Hermann. Yeah, Hermann, my question is I'd like to get your thoughts on what the effect of the so-called, the supposed commoditization of machine learning algorithms. You mentioned BERTA earlier. I'm often having conversations, particularly with investors, about what the effect of this commoditization of algorithms is going to have on the ability of software startups who are based on artificial intelligence or machine learning. What's their ability to capture value? How are they going to be defensible? And I've often thought about this in the sense of, the BBC Micro and Apple II are both based on the 6502 microprocessors, as you mentioned. So, is it the case that the commoditization of the kind of component parts of the technology actually help companies to capture value, or it hinders their ability to capture value?
I want to give two different answers to that. One is the commoditization of the standard algorithms, of course, allows people to take them and then apply it for particular applications where the main value really seems to be to have a deep understanding of the needs of the application, and then pick some of the standard algorithms to help you with that. But it takes somebody to really understand an application area well to make a success of the company that uses ML. But it's really the combination of the domain knowledge of the application and the algorithm. So that's one way in which I think we can build viable companies, and lots of viable companies are being built that way. But I think there's also the other one. And one of the nice things about AI and machine learning is that it's such a big space. One of the reasons why you need a special processor for graphs is the graphs are such a generic way of representing knowledge that the way you, the opportunity to come up with new algorithms and new ways of representing knowledge for particular problems is so vast. It's a bit like quantum computing. Hilbert space is a big space. This is also a big space. So I don't think there is any problem with really clever companies differentiating themselves technically and maybe also getting patents out of this. So I'm an optimist about this.
Hi, Herman. Thanks a lot for finding the time to talk. My question is going back to the early days of the microcomputer industry in the UK and the BBC program that you mentioned. So do you think we need something similar on AI, like the BBC computer program, to counterbalance the scary stories that circulate around in many guises?
Well, in a way, we have it with the Raspberry Pi, on a very sort of fundamental level. There are lots of people playing with Raspberry Pis and machine learning programs and Python on top of it, because people often forget that the Pi in Raspberry Pi actually refers to Python. It would be nice, but it's difficult to reproduce a national program like the computer program that was started by the BBC. I think it would be highly desirable because people really ought to understand what the opportunities of AI and ML are, and also its limitations. But I can't see a nation or the BBC putting that on at the moment, but it would be highly desirable, I agree.
I highly recommend to everyone to watch Micro Men, which was a BBC sort of quasi-documentary, quasi-fictional recount of the birth of the personal computer industry in the UK, and an extremely dapper Hermann features prominently, unsurprisingly. I presume you've seen that series before, Hermann.
Yes, people come to see me and Chris and want to write stories about the BBC macro days, etc. And so did these guys from the BBC when they made the Micromen. And I thought I was just another one who was trying to, talk a little bit about that period. But I actually think it's by far the best documentary of that period that I have seen. And they asked me to be an extra in one of the scenes, and Sophie Wilson is an extra. She's the barmaid in the last scene, if you've seen the thing. And I thought that this is just another silly movie, and declined. And I would have liked to have been an extra in there. I think it's a very, very good movie.
Well, we'll take the last two as a pair, and Herman, I can't thank you enough for your generous time already. I'll read them out because Kumi is actually having breakfast, but he knows you, I gather, from Cambridge activities with Broadcom and through Tim Ramsdale of Agile. But Kumi's question is, how will quantum computing potentially affect existing encryption models on the internet? and should we be worried? That's a question on quantum. And then a question from my brilliant colleague, Sam Endicott. What is the one question that you ask every entrepreneur before you invest in them?
Okay, so first the quantum story. As many of you probably know, the excitement about quantum computers is that the performance of a quantum computer goes exponentially with the number of qubits. Unfortunately, the difficulty of adding another qubit also rises exponentially. And one of the investments that I have in quantum computing is actually in Innsbruck. So I grew up in the Tyrol, the mountainous part of Austria, the skiing part of Austria. And Innsbruck University has not one, but two of the world's leading quantum computer groups. One, a experimental one, which is one of the world records of entangled qubits, and the other one, the theoretical one. And I sponsored one of the professors there, a guy called Wolfgang Lechner. And he's come up with a new architecture, a bit like the RISC architecture, called LHZ for Lechner, Hauke, and Zoller, that solves that problem. He found a very unexpected mapping of the n by n entangled qubit problem that normally quantum computers have to solve to an architecture that has n square qubits, but they only need to be entangled to the 4 nearest neighbors, so it becomes scalable. So here, the answer to your question about encryption. The best known algorithm in quantum computers called the Shor's algorithm, which has an exponential performance increase over classical algorithms in breaking codes. So everybody expects that once we have quantum computers that are not particularly, 100 qubits is probably enough, 100 or 200 qubits, we will be able to crack all the existing codes, or the main code that we're using, which is the DES encryption. Now, there are a number of quantum secure encryption methods now, but they really ought to be introduced now. Because if in phi, it's very difficult to predict when we have viable quantum computers, but certainly within the next 5 to 10 years. So you've got to think about anything that the governments or the military or you privately encrypt now. You've got to accept that probably in 5 to 7 years that will be cracked and it will be available for everybody to read. So the sooner we go to better encryption standards so that this doesn't happen, the better.
We have Hermann Marius of Checkpoint, I think, dialing in from Tel Aviv, so I'm sure he would have thoughts on that too. But sorry, I interrupted you. You were going to answer the question you ask every entrepreneur.
Yes. So the single. Well, I don't know if I explicitly asked them, but and I think most venture capitalists feel the same way. It's this thing about passion. Out of all the parameters, you can do the market and the technical team and the technology and all those. But at the end of the day, I think it's back to an earlier question whether I found any common characteristics between Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, or Bezos. They're all incredibly passionate, high energy individuals. So unless I see that passion, that dedication to really wanting to make a go of this company, that would be my single most important question.
Well, Hermann, your own passion is tangible, and the energy with which you recount your many, many first minutes and your extraordinary, illustrious career is a real inspiration. So I can't thank you enough for taking the time. I think approaching 8 p.m. in New Zealand. So we're hugely, hugely grateful to you. And I hope to see you very soon.
Indeed. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to everybody. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much, Hermann. Have a great day, everyone.